everybody. I'm Danny Grossman, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, the chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz, and thanks for joining us.
Hi.
Well, Professor, things seem to be heating up all over the world, but before we get into today's questions, we'd like to mark the passing of Israel Prize laureate, indisputably one of Israel's greatest authors and ideologues, Amos Oz. Besides being a prolific writer, his soulful political activity commanded the respect from all walks of Israeli life. His book, A Tale of Love and Darkness, was named one of the 10 most important books since the creation of the State of Israel, and was made into a movie by a former student of yours, Natalie Portman. Well, when he wasn't afraid of anything really, but extremists from the opposite side branded him at times a traitor. Indeed, President Reuven Rivlin compared Amos Oz to the prophet Jeremiah, who also faced accusations, but whose words have had a lasting effect not only on our people, but on the entire world.
כמה יקר וחשוב היית למדינת ישראל, לחברה הישראלית, לעולם הספרות. עיניך הביטו תמיד על העולם ברכות ובחדות גם יחד. עמוק מבפנים ותמיד גם קצת מבחוץ.
I was fortunate and honored to count Amos among my friends. He endorsed my book, The Case for Peace. He said in the endorsement that it gave him a thrill to read my proposal. We had very similar views on many issues and sometimes different views on other issues. I would always look forward to the occasional Shabbat dinner I had with him. He was an amazing and remarkable man. My view is that his best book was not The Tale of Love and Darkness, but his last major book, the book on Judas, where he writes about how societies, both at the time of Jesus and at the time of the founding of Israel, dealt with people who had very, very dissenting views. He writes about an Israeli who didn't believe in the statehood of Israel and compares him to the biblical character Judas, who gets such a bad name in Christian history. It's an absolutely brilliant book, but of course The Tale of Love and Darkness is a great book. So many other books by Michael, I've read them all, and he was a great man. He was also a real mensch. I mean, you could sit down and talk to him and his ideas, his open-mindedness. He would listen to people from all sides of the political spectrum. He didn't fit any particular category. He was a fervent Zionist. He believed in the nation state of the Jewish people, but he strongly believed that the solution for Zionism is to give the Palestinians their own state and to let Israel be the nation state, the democratic nation state of the Jewish people. And I agreed with him on that. And we'll miss him tremendously. I visited him, spoke to him, spent time with him. I wish I had spent more time with him, but he was truly one of the most remarkable men of my generation.
Absolutely. I remember meeting him, I think, for the first time together with you. And even though people considered him left-wing, and of course he would always make a differentiation between his writing and his political activity, and he was a member of the Meretz Party at one point, and he would speak at political rallies to the far left, but I think he commanded the respect even from the right. And Miri Regev, who is the current Minister for Culture in the Likud, even though she seems to be someone who would like to stifle views opposite herself, was extremely, extremely forthcoming in her praise of Amos Oz as an ideologue, as someone who was not afraid to voice his ideas, and someone who, because you said, he was a mensch, he commanded everyone's respect.
And I think the greatest tragedy, literarily, is that he never won the Nobel Prize. He was constantly in consideration for it, and I think had he not been an Israeli, he would have won the Nobel Prize. His literature, on the basis of its quality, deserved the Nobel Prize, but in literature they divided among nations, among areas of the world, and he was never in the position where he could win the Nobel Prize over somebody from a different part of the world or a different culture. But he certainly deserved the Nobel Prize, along with so many other Jewish and Israeli writers who wrote in the same or similar vein as he did, critically but lovingly about Israel and the Jewish people.
And that was well recognized within Israel, like I say, from all walks of life. Prime Minister Netanyahu, who himself is someone who really values history, also looked upon Amos Oz's writings and his effect on Jewish people, not only in Israel, but all over the world.
Well, when you compare him, for example, to his contemporary, Philip Roth, who died just a little earlier, there are some great similarities. They both had amazing insights into the character of the Jewish people. But of course, Philip Roth wrote humorously and bitingly and scathingly, sometimes even hatefully, about the Jewish experience, whereas Amos, although he felt sorry and was sorrowful about aspects of the Jewish experience, he always wrote out of love. And he didn't use his cutting edge of humor to put down people or to put down concepts in the way that Philip Roth did. But the two of them together, Philip Roth and Amos Oz, contributed so much to an understanding of Jews in the last part of the 20th and first part of the 21st century.
And there were people whose prose was absolutely, just like you said, they're all page turners, everything he ever wrote. So I'd like to move on now. And our next question comes from Chen, who is a student here, but who previously studied in Florida, where you are, and in Switzerland. And she, like the rest of us, is waiting to see what emerges from the Mueller investigation. So let's hear from her.
Hi, Professor Dershowitz. I'm Chen. Robert Mueller is supposed to be releasing his report soon. What can we expect? If you were President Trump's lawyer, how would you recommend him to prepare for it?
Well, those are great questions. I have a piece in today's The Hill which directly addresses that question, what I would recommend President Trump to do. I also have a book coming out literally tomorrow. It's a revision of my first book on impeachment, and it's called The Case Against the Democratic House Impeaching Trump.
Wow.
My first book was only about constitutional law. This book is also about the politics of impeachment and why it would be a terrible mistake for the Democrats to try to impeach rather than to try to defeat him in the 2020 election from the polls. I think the Mueller report will be devastating politically. It will put together a range of circumstantial arguments. It will show how many people who President Trump surrounded himself with have been indicted for lying and business corruption. And it will leave to the reader to infer what they choose to from that. It will probably lay out a case for obstruction, but not indict him for obstruction. I don't know what it will do on the Russian collusion. Remember, collusion is not a crime. You require a criminal conspiracy, and I just don't see the evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving President Trump and the Russians, but I haven't seen the report. The one thing that's absolutely clear is that the report should not be released until the Trump team has an opportunity to review it and to respond to it. And then the two reports, the Mueller report and the Trump report, should be issued simultaneously so that the American public can judge for itself which has the better argument. Remember, all prosecutorial reports are one-sided. They only hear evidence of guilt. They don't hear exculpatory evidence. They don't hear cross-examination of their witnesses. And so if you just release the Mueller report, it would be extremely one-sided. But if you allow the Trump legal team to prepare a response over, say, a 10-day period, and then release them together, I think that would serve the interests of fairness and the interests of information. I still go back to my original point. I don't think there should have been a special counsel. I think there should have been an independent, nonpartisan commission of experts looking into the Russian influence on American elections, which continues. And it would have provided information, not accusations. And I think the American public would have been far better off. Let the accusations be done by the U.S. attorney's offices. They have the competence to do that, and they are investigating some of the material from Trump colleagues and associates. So I think it was a mistake from the beginning to have a special counsel, but the Trump team has to deal with that, and I hope they'll have an opportunity to respond before it's made public.
Well, thank you, Alan. One thing, as they say in America, tachlis, the real down-to-earth issue is when that report comes out, like you were talking about, the chances, the probability that this will be leaked, parts of it, even if people have it under lock and key, and then that becoming the subject which America will be discussing, I think is enormous. You've written about that yourself, how that's one of your major concerns.
Right, but I think that if it were not given to Congress, Congress will leak it. The minute it gets into the hands of Democrats, they will leak it, because it's not national security. Right. They will leak it. But I think if it's given just to the Trump team, I don't think they have an interest in leaking it. They might leak that it's not very strong or something like that, but I don't think they would actually leak the information. Look, it's the best you can do. I don't think it would be fair just to release the Mueller report without the Trump team having an opportunity. I don't think the public even has to know that the Mueller report is completed. I think once it's completed, it's handed over to the Attorney General. Who that person is up in the air. Is it Whitaker, the acting Attorney General? Is it Barr, the Attorney General designate? Is it Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, who was in charge of this investigation? They should get it confidentially and then confidentially hand it over to Jay Sekulow and Rudy Giuliani on a confidential basis. Let no one know it's even completed. And then 10 days later or 2 weeks later, let the Attorney General, whoever he is, release both reports together and let the public judge.
Is there any other advice you might have for the president? I know you are not his counselor, but if he were to turn to you, what would you tell him to do?
Well, first, I wouldn't give him legal advice because I'm not his lawyer, and you shouldn't give legal advice to somebody who you're not representing because it's not covered by the lawyer-client privilege. So most of the advice I give is on television. Right. I used to give advice on CNN and on MSNBC and on Fox, but CNN has apparently decided that my views are not particularly consistent with their narrative, so I haven't been on CNN now since the summer. But I am on Fox. I was on Fox this morning. I'll be on Fox again in the next few days. I try to be what they call me the voice of reason or clarity or objectivity. And the advice that I would give on television, look, I previously gave him 4 bits of advice. Don't fire, don't pardon, don't testify, and don't tweet. He didn't follow much of that advice. He followed some of it, but not others. My advice now would be to file the strongest possible rebuttal and make sure that the public understands the difference between sin and crime. Sin is for the Inquisition and for the Crusades and for the witch trials. A prosecutor only has the jurisdiction to come up with crimes. That's the mistake that Comey made. Comey not only said that Hillary Clinton wasn't guilty, but then he expressed his own opinion about how she had acted, and that was absolutely improper and may have affected the election. I hope that Mueller doesn't make the same mistake and express opinions about political sins or disagreements or things that people might reasonably regard as wrong. It's not the job of the prosecutor to uncover wrongdoing. It's the job of the prosecutor to uncover specific federal statutory crimes. And if it's not a specific federal statutory crime, it is frankly none of the business of any prosecutor, even including a special counsel.
Well, thank you, Alan, for that. And now I'd like to move on to something else which also came up most recently, a New York Times front page article about a Gazan medic who was killed during a violent protest on Israel's border. And what I'd like to do is also show a very brief clip from the IDF spokesman in which they talk about her, but I know you've also spoken about that. So, Alan, what is your take on that story?
Well, I think it was outrageous. I think it was outrageous for a number of reasons. Number one, it got to be on the first page over the crease in the right-hand corner, which is where the most important news in the world is. And this was a story about one medic who threw a smoke bomb and declared herself to be a human shield, being killed under circumstances which may conceivably involve some negligence or culpability on the part of one Israeli soldier. The next day, Monday, where people don't read the Times as much as they do Sunday, there was a story slightly shorter, but on the same space, involving massive genocide, massive killings of Afghanis, including a whole family of innocent people and children and babies, by Afghan-led troops under the supervision of the American CIA. The idea that those stories deserve equal space in the New York Times, a story about American involvement in massacres of families and many, many more people, deserves the same coverage as one medic under questionable circumstances being killed by one Israeli soldier under questionable circumstances, shows the incredible bias of the New York Times. Also, the New York Times referred to all the people as protesters. Remember, these are people who came with scissors, knives, Molotov cocktails, maps of civilian areas in order to kill and kidnap as many Israelis as possible. This was an invasion by Hamas fighters under the cover and with the protection of civilian human shields. That was never, ever mentioned in the New York Times story. The New York Times story simply characterized the IDF video as tendentious and selectively edited, but they didn't include the video so that people could decide for themselves. The video should now be put online along with what the IDF did in terms of editing. I don't think anybody can dispute the fact that this woman threw a smoke bomb and that she declared herself to be a human shield and essentially a martyr. Does she qualify as a combatant or not? Those are hard questions under international law and under Israeli law. What is not a hard question is that this is a disputed, controversial, and difficult case that the Israeli government will handle as it handles all of these cases, whereas some of these other stories, like in Afghanistan, aren't controversial at all. There is not a single word in the Times story about terror tunnels, about rockets, about other attempts by Hamas to destroy Israel and destroy Israelis. There wasn't even a mention that any description of the Israelis who live in areas right adjacent to the wall. I've been there with you, Danny. And the idea that there's no discussion of the trauma that these people suffer on a daily basis. And, let's not confuse this with the West Bank. This is Israel proper. This is Israel that was allocated to the nation state of the Jewish people by the United Nations. This is an area where Jews built from scratch on sandy land, places to live, Sderot and other places, and kibbutzim right on the border. And the idea that the Times would eliminate and omit the complexity and the nuance of the relationship between Hamas and these Jewish civilians, never once mentioning the double war crimes that Hamas commits on a daily basis. That is, firing rockets, 1,000 of them in the year 2018, firing rockets at Israeli civilians, a war crime, from behind Palestinian civilians, a war crime. No mention. The only mention of war crime in the New York Times story is a statement that this young Israeli sniper may have committed a war crime. That's the only mention of war crimes in the entire article. Shame on the New York Times. It was horrible, irresponsible reporting by the newspaper of record. But unfortunately, it's what we've come to expect. We have now seen almost no distinction between the front page and the editorial page of the New York Times when it comes to Israel, when it comes to American politics, and when it comes to many, many other issues.
Well, Alan, like you mentioned, we were together at actually a border outpost of the IDF where you could see from many, many different screens the activity along the border. And you yourself remarked how amazing it was, how much real-time information that the Israelis had and how difficult the decisions that the people who are on the front lines, the snipers, who never had time to, had very little time to make decisions. And when there are people coming to cross the border, and like you mentioned, with the exact purpose of crossing that border, breaking down the fence so they could go in with targets of Israeli civilian kibbutzim and towns, and so they would go in and possibly take hostages or whatever to use them as huge bargaining chips. And yet all of that is completely not mentioned in the Times, like you mentioned. It's just like they're giving no perspective about that whole incident, as if one morning an Israeli sniper woke up and said, "Let me go and shoot someone." And even the Times did say that she wasn't even, they noted that she wasn't even an intended target, that the bullet had been a bullet which skipped off the ground and hit her, so she wasn't even targeted. And yet, even so, to make your point even stronger, the Israeli IDF military advocate general, whose job it is to investigate these types of incidents, investigates every questionable death. And they're doing a full-blown investigation, which means automatically this can't be a war crime that has to be looked at by an international criminal court, because Israel itself is looking at it and dealing with it. And if there is any inappropriate behavior, those people will be punished. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to dedicate one of our future programs to give you a cockpit view from what it's like to be in the pilot's seat. And we're going to do that in a future show. So I think this is all important for you to continue to bring out and continue to be a voice of clarity in this area. So thank you very much for that.
Well, I try to do it because it's important for the truth to come out and for people to know this is a very complicated issue. When you have thousands of people trying to break down a fence and endangering the lives of Israeli babies and children, there's kindergartens right near there. There are schools. We know that not so long ago, a rocket hit a bus and a rocket hit a school. It's only a matter of time before one of these rockets kills Israeli children. And that will be obviously a cause of major retaliation. And it will be bad for the Palestinians in Gaza and bad for Israel. But to place all the blame on Israel for the actions of one soldier who's being investigated, is just such bad and shoddy reporting. Wow. But they'll probably get a Pulitzer Prize for that reporting. Some of the worst and shoddiest reporting by the New York Times, by the Miami Herald, by many, many other newspapers get the Pulitzer Prizes because of the very shoddiness makes them dramatic and overstates. And that's what the Pulitzer Committee often looks to.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for your time, Professor Dershowitz. If you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to iltv.tv or our Facebook page and submit them, and we'll see you again next week.